Welcome to the latest sparkling edition of Beeb Watch. What's that I can hear? That's the sound of the state broadcaster quaking in its boots, because this is the show where I peel back the curtain on the BBC and give it the TalkTV treatment. And remember, I'm watching the Beeb, so you don't have to. If you want to be put off your weekend cornflakes, or you just want to go back to sleep on the Sabbath, why not try Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg? It's the political panel show that's a cure for insomnia. But this weekend, Ben Elton was a guest. Ben Elton, if you're one of the younger viewers to Beeb Watch, he was quite a famous kind of socialist comedian back in the 1980s. Made a whole living out of taking the mickey out of Margaret Thatcher. Thatch. It was supposed to be funny, it wasn't really. Now, this is the guy who wrote such classics as Blackadder, The Young Ones. He also wrote the Queen musical, We Will Rock You. I'll never forgive him for that. Anyway, he cropped up on Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg, ostensibly to promote some old rubbish he's made for Channel 4 about railways, but it wasn't long before he laid into one of his traditional long socialist rants, droning on and on and on about Rishi Sunak. Have a look.
I have to say, Ben, you were looking distinctly unimpressed throughout that interview. Fair to say, I think you've never been a fan of the Conservatives, but what did you think of what Mr Sunak said?
It's not so much depressed as sad. I mean, if anybody was still watching after that extraordinary Orwellian, meaningless, evasive word salad, I mean, everybody else wanted to believe, and I sort of believe maybe he's kind of a bit more decent, you know, and it turns out he's as much of a mendacious, narcissistic sociopath as his previous boss.
He talks about word salad. Mendacious, narcissistic sociopath. It could have been about me, actually. But seriously, that's way over the top about Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak was merely talking about the cost of living crisis, how he plans to tackle it, how he plans to help people with their mortgages, etc., etc. It was just classic, fairly bland political stuff. An interview between Laura Kuenssberg and Rishi Sunak. By the way, Laura didn't get the memo that weekend that Russia was on the point of World War III. Didn't even mention it. But anyway, they talked about the cost of living crisis, and then Ben, didn't just go over the top, he soared over the top. As I say, he talks about word salad, that was word salad. But this is classic of the state broadcaster. Someone should have challenged him on that, maybe even Laura. No, his ludicrous attack on poor old Rishi, of course, went completely unchallenged. The state broadcaster tells us it is not biased towards the left. Of course it is. Ben Elton is their perfect celebrity, an age-old, ancient socialist, champagne socialist, of course, because he's worth millions. Ben is a committed socialist because he can afford it. Later, Ben went on to an obscure radio channel and said that he did not set out to mug the Prime Minister. Yeah. Right. He said he went on to promote his railway programme, which is basically true, but you can tell he was chomping at the bit. He couldn't wait to attack the evil Tories. He hasn't changed in 40 years, that guy. So as an apology, it didn't really pass the test. One of the problems at the BBC is that it does not and never has understood the working classes. This was pointed out by BBC stalwart and also a working class person who happens to be a Lord Melvyn Bragg. He said the trouble with the Beeb is it has no concept of anyone being working class and happy, working class and successful, working class and having a nice life. Millions of working class people do just that. But as Lord Bragg underlined, when a blue collar person goes onto the BBC, they have to be depressed. Their lives have to be in ruin. They have to be poverty stricken. They have to be afflicted with mental health issues and so on and so forth. The BBC is the same about soldiers, military veterans. It has no concept of the fact that people can actually come out of the army happy and contented and go on to live very pleasant lives. The liberal elite at the BBC, who see themselves as oozing sympathy for the lower orders, as they call them, they just don't get them. They just don't get them. If you're working class, if you don't live in a mansion, if you don't live in Hampstead or Islington, where the BBC staff all live, then you must be miserable. When was the last time on a news story you saw a happy working class person? Can't remember it, can you? It never happens on the BBC. Lord Bragg is right, and this is a man right from the heart of the BBC. He sees the problem. Trouble is, the executives at the state broadcaster don't. The Martin Bashir nightmare continues apace. This, of course, concerns the fact that their former star reporter Bashir conned Princess Diana into that bombshell interview a quarter of a century ago in which she talked about 3 people being in her marriage. It blew the royal family apart. It was a sensation. 25 years later, we learned that that bombshell interview was obtained by nefarious methods. Now, an investigative journalist and documentary maker called Andy Webb has for some time been trying to get from the state broadcaster all the emails between various executives and Bashir concerning this issue, concerning this scandalous saga. Now, he's been given some, but he wants thousands more than 2,000 more. Now, the BBC have always said, well, we couldn't quite do that because at the time you wanted them, Martin Bashir was too ill to cooperate. So Andy Webb now says, well, he's not ill anymore. Can I have these emails? But it's essentially going to a tribunal. So Andy Webb says that the BBC deliberately concocted Bashir's illness, or shall we say exaggerated it, to make sure that he did not get the emails that he thinks will expose the true horror of what went on at Broadcasting House when Bashir was busy conning Princess Diana, or rather after he'd conned her. Because what we did find out only recently, and it essentially cost a few jobs, was that the BBC knew all about what happened 25 years ago, but they tried to keep it under wraps. Well, we know the story now. Andy Webb says we haven't heard anything like the full story. The BBC denies all of his allegations, all of his accusations. But trust me, we haven't heard the last of this. Andy Webb is a very determined man. And if he gets hold of those controversial emails, God knows what's going to be in them. Well, Glastonbury's over. 1,000 BBC staff no doubt had the time of their lives covering that event. Most of the time it gets audiences of hundreds of thousands, which hardly justifies sending so many staff, so many expensive staff to cover a pop concert. However, in fairness, the big event, after a lackluster few days, was of course the finale, the grand finale, possibly his last live concert ever by Sir Elton John, and that pulled in a massive audience of 7.6 million. So fair play on that score, although I'm not sure it justifies 1,000 staff. However, the coverage of that event, it just makes you puke. All these old people from Radio 1 gushing about, oh, marvellous, fantastic. I mean, according to these rock sycophants, that's all they are. I mean, their tongues are hanging out, brown tongues, brown noses. Everything is wonderful. They never criticise everything. Oh, that was fantastic. And they're always talking about bands you've never heard of. Never heard them better, have you? No, never heard them. And they're so old. I mean, Lauren Laverne's 45, Joe Wiley's 57, 102 between them. What are they still doing there? They got rid of that old guy, Mark Ratcliffe, but the veterans are still there, and their coverage is asinine, stupid, ridiculous, utterly uncritical. And I just wish they would take a more adult approach to this event. Just because they're pop correspondents doesn't mean to say they have to act as if they're in their early teens, particularly if you happen to be 57. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm contradicting myself because only recently I was droning on about ageism at the BBC, where they get rid of brilliant DJs and brilliant presenters just because they've hit the age of 60. Well, fair enough. But I do think there's a case to say, why would a pop presenter be 60 or nearly 60? I mean, you know, it isn't a genre for pensioners. Now I come to think about it, it's really weird actually that the only old people that the BBC's prepared to employ are the ancient codgers that work at Radio 1 and Glastonbury, presenting pop programmes for young people. Well, why do they get everything wrong? That's it for this week's Beeb Watch. Let me know your thoughts in the comments box below, and if you want to make this TalkTV's most watched show ever, why not subscribe? It's exactly £159 cheaper than subscribing to the BBC. In other words, it's free. Till next week, I'm off to destroy my Blackadder collection and I'm heading to the BBC. I'm going to apply to be one of the presenters for next year's Glastonbury. I'm way too young, but you never know. That's it.